The rhythmic squeak of Clarice's mop echoed in the deserted hallway, a lonely counterpoint to the distant hum of the city waking. Thursday mornings in Milton University's math building always held a peculiar stillness, a hushed anticipation before the flood of students and lectures disrupted the sterile air. Clarice, in her faded blue uniform, was a phantom, her presence barely registering in the grand scheme of academic pursuits. Her world was one of polished floors, emptied wastebaskets, and the faint scent of disinfectant, a world that existed on the periphery of the brilliant minds that occupied these hallowed halls. She knew the routines of the professors like the back of her hand. Professor Langston's habit of leaving his office door slightly ajar, Professor Kane's insistence on a fresh pot of coffee before his 9 a.m. lecture, Dr. Brooks' meticulous arrangement of her desk, every pen aligned just so. Clarice observed these details, not with judgment, but with the detached curiosity of an outsider looking in. She was invisible, a silent witness to the intellectual ballet that unfolded around her, her own thoughts a carefully guarded secret. Today, however, a different kind of energy thrummed in the air. A low murmur emanated from the faculty lounge, the clinking of coffee cups punctuated by excited whispers. As Clarice finished mopping the hallway outside, her gaze was drawn to the whiteboard inside the lounge. It was covered in a dense thicket of symbols, an intricate mathematical equation that snaked across the surface like a cryptic message. She paused, the mop handle held loosely in her hand. The equation was complex, a tangled web of Greek letters, exponents, and integrals, a language she hadn't encountered in years. Yet, a strange flicker of recognition sparked within her, a dormant part of her mind awakening as if from a long slumber. She found herself drawn to it, her gaze tracing the lines, deciphering the symbols, a forgotten melody stirring in her soul. Professor Langston emerged from the lounge, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He adjusted his bow tie, a nervous tic Clarice had observed over the years. "It's a beauty, isn't it, Brennan?" he declared, addressing a young graduate assistant, guaranteed to stump even the most brilliant minds in the department. He gestured towards the whiteboard with a flourish, oblivious to Clarice's presence. "This, my boy, is the key to unlocking the mysteries of." He launched into a detailed explanation of the equation's significance, using terms that flew over Brennan's head and strangely resonated deep within Clarice's quiet mind. She felt a peculiar pull, a yearning to understand, to delve deeper into the intricate dance of numbers and symbols. She stood there, unnoticed, the forgotten mop still in her hand, as Professor Langston continued his pronouncements. Later, as the professors gathered for their morning coffee, their voices buzzing with speculation about the equation, Clarice continued her work, emptying the overflowing trash bins, her mind still wrestling with the problem. The professors' conversation drifted towards her, snippets of their discussion reaching her ears. "Who do you think will crack it first?" "Kane, most likely. He's been obsessed with this type of problem for months. Perhaps young Brennan. He's got a sharp mind." Clarice pushed her cleaning cart past the open door, her heart pounding a strange rhythm against her ribs. She had a nagging feeling, an intuition that whispered the solution was within her grasp. The following morning, Clarice arrived at the math building to find a palpable tension in the air. The whiteboard was still covered with the equation, but now, a new addition stood out, a neatly written solution underneath, elegant and concise. A hush fell over the room as Professor Langston entered, followed by a cluster of other professors, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. Who solved it?" Professor Langston's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the solution. "Dr. Brooks, the only black professor in the department, a woman whose quiet strength Clarice had always admired, spoke up, a knowing look in her eyes. "It seems we have an unsung hero among us." Her gaze shifted to Clarice, who stood silently by the door, her cleaning supplies in hand. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, a whirlwind of speculation and accusations. Professor Kane's voice cut through the noise, sharp and dismissive. "A janitor? Impossible. It has to be a prank." Brennan, his brow furrowed in thought, echoed the sentiment. How could someone with no formal training solve something this complex? Clarice's hands tightened around the handle of her mop, her heart pounding against her ribs. The weight of their disbelief pressed down on her, a familiar burden. Years of being overlooked, of being underestimated, had taught her to keep her head down, to blend into the background. Yet, a spark of defiance ignited within her, a quiet rebellion against the assumptions that had defined her existence. Dr. Brooks stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm. "What happens?" she said, her words hanging in the air. "When a woman who cleans the halls solves the equation no professor could." Her gaze locked with Clarice's, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience, the unspoken understanding of the biases they faced. Clarice's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. The whispers intensified, the room buzzing with a strange mixture of admiration and suspicion. The equation on the whiteboard, once a symbol of intellectual challenge, now stood as a testament to her hidden potential, a silent challenge to the established order. She had unwittingly shattered the illusion, exposed the cracks in the ivory tower. The world she had occupied on the periphery had suddenly shifted, and Clarice, the invisible janitor, was finally seen. The stale scent of yesterday's coffee hung in the air, a phantom aroma mingling with the dry erase marker fumes that permeated the Milton University Math Department lounge. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy window panes, cast long, uneven stripes across the worn carpet. A low hum of conversation, punctuated by the sharp clack of chalk against the whiteboard, filled the room. Professor Kane, his tweed jacket straining against his ample midsection, held court, a smug grin plastered on his face. He gestured towards a complex equation sprawling across the whiteboard, a labyrinth of Greek symbols and mathematical notations. "And who amongst us," he boomed, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction, "can unravel this little conundrum?" Dr. Brooks, the sole splash of color in the room with her vibrant crimson dress, leaned against the back wall, her arms crossed. Her gaze, sharp and discerning, swept over the assembled professors, a flicker of amusement playing on her lips. She knew this ritual, the daily intellectual sparring, a thinly veiled display of ego and academic one-upmanship. It was a game she rarely indulged in, preferring the quiet solitude of her own research. Brennan, a graduate assistant with a perpetually anxious air about him, nervously adjusted his glasses. He stared at the equation, a furrow deepening between his brows. The symbols swam before his eyes, a chaotic jumble of meaningless abstractions. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach, a mixture of inadequacy and intimidation. Perhaps I should have pursued a different field, he thought, the fleeting thought quickly suppressed by a surge of stubborn determination. Professor Langston, a man whose arrogance was surpassed only by his intellect, stepped forward. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, his eyes gleaming with a predatory focus. "Child's play," he declared, snatching a piece of chalk from the ledge. He began to scribble on the board, his movements swift and precise, a flurry of equations unfolding beneath his hand. A subtle shift in the room's atmosphere signaled the unspoken acknowledgement of Langston's prowess. He was the undisputed king of this particular jungle. Clarice Daniels, unnoticed as always in her gray janitor's uniform, continued her work, emptying the overflowing trash bins. The rhythmic swoosh of the wastebasket lid, the quiet scrape of her shoes against the linoleum, were the background music to the professor's intellectual performance. She glanced at the equation, her gaze lingering for a moment, a spark of recognition flickering in her dark eyes. She quickly averted her gaze, her heart beating a little faster. "Don't look, don't engage," she told herself, her hands tightening around the trash bag. She had learned long ago to keep her intellectual curiosity hidden, a secret treasure buried deep within. Langston finished his calculations, capping his marker with a flourish. He turned to the room, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Elementary, my dear colleagues," he announced, his voice laced with condescension. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, landing on Clarice. A cruel glint entered his eyes. "Hey, Clarice," he called out, his voice dripping with mock solicitousness. "You want to take a stab at this one?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Clarice. A wave of heat flushed her cheeks. She felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken judgment, the palpable disbelief. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows, to become invisible. But something inside her, a flicker of defiance, refused to let her shrink away. "They think I'm nothing," she thought, the thought a bitter taste in her mouth. "They see only the uniform, the mop, the broom. They don't see the mind beneath." Her hands, still encased in the worn rubber gloves, trembled slightly. "Well, Clarice," Langston pressed, his voice laced with amusement. "Don't be shy. Show us your mathematical prowess." Clarice took a deep breath, the silence of the room pressing in on her. The air crackled with anticipation, a strange mixture of amusement and disdain. Brennan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flitting between Clarice and the equation. Dr. Brooks watched with an unreadable expression, her eyes fixed on Clarice's face. Slowly, deliberately, Clarice removed her gloves, the sound of the snapping latex echoing in the stillness. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes. It was a signal, a declaration. She was no longer the invisible janitor. She was Clarice Daniels, and she was about to show them what she was capable of. A single, quiet sound escaped her lips. "H," she breathed, the sound barely audible. She stepped towards the whiteboard, her gaze fixed on the complex equation. The world around her faded away, the mocking laughter, the condescending stares, the oppressive silence. All that remained was the equation, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument, began to work, dissecting the problem, analyzing the variables, searching for the solution. As she picked up a piece of chalk, her hand steady and sure, a faint smile played on her lips. The thrill of the challenge, the pure joy of mathematics, surged through her veins. She was home. The stale scent of yesterday's coffee clung to the air in the Milton University Math Department lounge, a subtle bitterness mirroring the mood that had settled over the room since Monday. Clarice Daniels, her hands still rough from the cleaning solution she used earlier, stood at the whiteboard, chalk dust clinging to her dark blue janitor's uniform like a second skin. She felt the weight of their stares, the palpable skepticism radiating from the cluster of professors gathered around the small, worn table in the corner. Professor Langston, the man who had posed the equation as a playful challenge, watched with a detached curiosity, his expression a carefully constructed mask. Kane, however, made no effort to hide his disdain. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowed as if expecting, willing her to fail. Clarice swallowed, the dryness in her throat constricting her breath. "Just finish it, Clarice. Get it over with." The chalk felt strangely unfamiliar in her hand, a tool of academia, a world she had long ago resigned herself to observing from the periphery. A low hum of conversation, a mix of doubt and derision, had filled the lounge each morning this week, their voices weaving a tapestry of her supposed audacity. A janitor solving Langston's equation? Preposterous. The words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the invisible wall that separated her from their world. She hadn't intended to draw attention. She'd simply been drawn to the elegant dance of symbols on the board. The complex equation, a siren's call to a part of her she had kept dormant for years. Now, standing here under the scrutiny of these academic giants, she felt exposed, vulnerable. A tremor ran through her hand as she wrote the first line of her solution, each stroke of the chalk a defiant act against the silence that had fallen over the room. The silence deepened as she continued, broken only by the rhythmic scratching of chalk against the board. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of anxieties and self-doubt, was now a place of quiet focus. The numbers and symbols flowed effortlessly, each step in the solution appearing in her mind's eye before she translated it onto the board. Years of suppressed mathematical passion surged through her, a powerful current pushing aside the years of scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans. She was no longer Clarice the janitor. She was Clarice the mathematician. This was her language, her domain. Professor Langston adjusted his glasses, a flicker of something akin to surprise crossing his features. Kane shifted in his seat, a restless energy radiating from him. Dr. Brooks, the only black professor in the department, observed Clarice with a steady, knowing gaze, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Brennan, the graduate assistant, leaned forward, his youthful face etched with a mixture of bewilderment and burgeoning curiosity. Clarice lost herself in the intricate steps of the equation. The world outside the whiteboard faded away, replaced by the pure, abstract beauty of mathematics. The complex problem unfolded before her like an intricate puzzle, each piece falling into place with satisfying precision. Her hand moved with increasing confidence, the chalk leaving a bold trail of logic and insight. She felt a sense of exhilaration, a surge of intellectual freedom she hadn't experienced in years. This is who I am. The thought echoed in her mind, a quiet affirmation of a truth she had long denied. As she neared the final steps, a sense of anticipation thickened the air in the lounge. The professors exchanged glances, their initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging acknowledgement of her skill. Even Kane, his usual arrogance seemingly diminished, watched with an intensity that bordered on fascination. Clarice took a deep breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. One more step. With a final flourish, she wrote the last line of the solution, the chalk leaving a decisive mark on the board. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. The equation, a complex tapestry of symbols and numbers, now stood complete, a testament to her hidden talent. "That should do it," Clarice murmured, the words barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. Her voice, usually soft and hesitant, carried a newfound strength, a quiet confidence that resonated in the stillness. The silence hung in the air for a long, charged moment. Professor Langston was the first to break it, a low cough escaping his lips. He pushed his glasses up his nose again, the gesture betraying a nervousness that belied his usual composure. He stared at the solution, his brow furrowed in thought. Clarice met his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral, a shield against the complex emotions churning within her. Relief, exhaustion, a flicker of triumph, and the ever-present fear of rejection warred within her. A tempest hidden beneath a calm exterior. Kane, his face flushed, remained silent, his eyes darting between the solution and Clarice, a mixture of suspicion and disbelief clouding his features. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if struggling to find the right words or perhaps any words at all. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the weight of unspoken assumptions. Dr. Brooks, her expression unreadable, offered Clarice a small, almost imperceptible nod. The gesture, subtle yet significant, was a silent acknowledgement, a spark of solidarity in a room charged with uncertainty. It was a lifeline in the sea of doubt, a silent promise of support in a world that had often felt hostile. Clarice clung to that small gesture, drawing strength from it, a fragile anchor in a storm of conflicting emotions. The silence stretched, a pregnant pause filled with the unspoken questions, the unacknowledged biases, and the faint, persistent whisper of hope. The stale scent of yesterday's coffee clung to the air in the math department lounge. A fitting metaphor, Clarice thought, for the stagnant attitudes she encountered daily. The low hum of conversation, usually a comforting background noise, now prickled with an unsettling undercurrent. She could feel their gazes, sharp and dissecting, like pins pricking her skin. Professor Langston's challenge, the complex equation scrawled across the whiteboard, had been meant to be a playful exercise, a mental flex for his graduate students. Clarice, tasked with cleaning the erasers, had simply solved it. A small, almost involuntary act like scratching an itch. Yet, this seemingly insignificant action had ignited a firestorm. "There's no way she did that herself," Professor Kane's voice, laced with suspicion, cut through the hushed whispers. Clarice's grip tightened on the cleaning cloth, her knuckles bone white. The cloth, damp and slightly rough against her skin, was a tangible anchor in a sea of swirling uncertainties. Kane's words, though not unexpected, still stung. They confirmed what she already knew. In their eyes, she was invisible, a ghost in her own workplace. A janitor, not someone capable of abstract thought, let alone mathematical brilliance. They see what they expect to see, she thought, the familiar bitter taste rising in her throat. It was the same taste she experienced in high school, the taste of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Professor Langston, his face a mask of thoughtful perplexity, paced before the whiteboard, his finger tracing the lines of Clarice's solution. A flicker of something akin to admiration crossed his features, quickly masked by a frown. He was clearly grappling with the implications, the sheer improbability of it all. Clarice watched him, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. Part of her, a small, hopeful part, wished for acknowledgement, for a simple nod of acceptance. But a larger, more cynical part braced for the inevitable dismissal, the casual wave of the hand that would brush her achievement aside like so much dust. Thursday morning bled into afternoon, the whispers intensifying, spreading like tendrils of smoke through the hallways. Clarice felt the weight of those whispers, the burden of their doubt, pressing down on her. She went about her work, emptying trash bins, wiping down tables, her movements precise and economical, a shield against the chaos swirling around her. Each swipe of the cloth, each methodical task, was a small act of defiance, a refusal to be consumed by their judgment. They can whisper all they want, she thought, her jaw tightening. It doesn't change the truth of the numbers, the elegant logic that unfolded in her mind like a blooming flower. By Thursday evening, the story had morphed, embellished with each retelling. The janitor, they said, had stumbled upon the solution by pure luck. Or perhaps she had cheated, somehow glimpsed the answer from one of the graduate students. The idea of a janitor, a black woman no less, possessing such intellectual prowess was simply inconceivable. The very thought seemed to offend their carefully constructed world of academic hierarchy. Clarice, alone in the deserted hallway, leaned against the cool tile wall, closing her eyes. The silence, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system, was a welcome respite. She could almost hear the echo of her own thoughts, clear and sharp against the quiet backdrop. They don't understand, she thought, a wave of weariness washing over her. They don't understand the joy of the numbers, the thrill of unraveling the puzzle. Mathematics, for her, wasn't a subject to be conquered, but a language to be spoken, a world to be explored. It was a refuge, a place where she could escape the limitations of her reality. Friday morning dawned, crisp and clear, the sunlight streaming through the large windows of the math department lounge. The tension, however, remained, thick and suffocating. Professor Langston, looking haggard and sleep-deprived, called a departmental meeting. Clarice, emptying the trash can near the door, caught snippets of the conversation. Unprecedented, integrity of the department, thorough investigation. The words swirled around her, meaningless and yet heavy with consequence. Dr. Brooks, the only black professor in the department, her gaze sharp and unwavering, entered the lounge. She met Clarice's eyes, a flicker of understanding passing between them. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared experience of existing in a space where their presence was constantly questioned, their abilities perpetually scrutinized. In that brief moment of connection, Clarice felt a surge of something akin to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't entirely alone in this battle. Dr. Brooks' voice, calm and steady, cut through the tense atmosphere of the meeting. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone laced with a subtle steel, "are we truly suggesting that Ms. Daniels is incapable of solving this equation simply because of her position?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Clarice, her heart pounding in her chest, continued her work, her movements almost robotic. She emptied the ashtrays, the metallic clinking of the butts against the ceramic a stark counterpoint to the hushed debate unfolding behind the closed doors of the lounge. Let them talk, she thought, a quiet strength settling within her. Let them dissect and analyze. It won't change who I am. She knew her worth, the depth of her understanding. Their doubts, their suspicions, were merely reflections of their own limitations, not hers. The equation, the elegant solution she had crafted, was her testament, her silent declaration of existence in a world that tried to erase her. The muted hum of the Friday afternoon settled over the faculty offices, a low thrum against the silence of emptying corridors. Professor Kane perched on the edge of his desk, fingers drumming an erratic rhythm against a stack of ungraded papers. He watched Langston pace, the older professor's reflection flickering in the darkening window pane like a restless ghost. The office, usually a sanctuary of intellectual pursuit, felt suffocating, thick with unspoken tension. Kane's skepticism curdled into something sourer, a resentment that gnawed at the edges of his composure. He hadn't slept well since Tuesday. The image of Clarice Daniels, a janitor, scribbling equations on his chalkboard, kept him awake, a splinter in his academic mind. He couldn't reconcile the image with the elegant solution she'd presented, the sheer audacity of it. It felt like a mockery, a cruel joke at the expense of years dedicated to the hallowed halls of mathematics. Langston stopped pacing, turning to face Kane, his gaze shadowed, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a grim set. "You still think someone gave her the answer, don't you?" He didn't phrase it as a question, but as a statement, a weary acknowledgement of the persistent doubt that clung to the department like a persistent fog. Kane shifted, the rustle of his tweed jacket echoing in the quiet room. He avoided Langston's eyes, focusing instead on the dust motes dancing in the sliver of sunlight that pierced through the blinds. "It's improbable, Gerald. Statistically improbable. The woman's a janitor. Her highest qualification is likely a high school diploma." He tasted bile at the back of his throat, the words feeling bitter even as he spoke them. His pride, the meticulously constructed edifice of his academic career, felt threatened. Langston sighed, the sound heavy with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep within his bones. He resumed his pacing, the rhythmic squeak of his shoes a counterpoint to Kane's restless drumming. "Improbable doesn't equate to impossible, Arthur." His voice was low, laced with a quiet conviction that made Kane bristle. "I've reviewed her solution. It's not just correct. It's elegant. Ingenious, even. It's the kind of thinking that can't be taught, the kind of intuitive leap that marks true mathematical talent." "Talent?" Kane scoffed, the word catching in his throat like a fishbone. "Or a well-executed cheat. Someone fed it to her, Gerald. One of the graduate students, perhaps. A misguided attempt at a prank." He clung to this theory, this fragile raft of disbelief in the face of the rising tide of evidence. To accept Clarice's brilliance would be to admit the possibility of overlooked genius, the potential for greatness hidden beneath layers of societal assumption and prejudice. And that, he realized with a chilling clarity, was a truth he wasn't ready to confront. Langston stopped pacing again, this time standing directly in front of Kane, his shadow falling over him like a shroud. "No one fed it to her," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. He met Kane's gaze, his eyes burning with an intensity that surprised Kane. "I was there, Arthur. I saw her working on it. I saw the concentration on her face, the way her hand moved across the board, almost as if the equations were flowing directly from her mind. It was mesmerizing." A flicker of something akin to wonder crossed Langston's face, a brief breach in the wall of his professional detachment. Kane recoiled from the intensity of Langston's gaze, a strange unease settling in his stomach. He hated being wrong. He hated the feeling of uncertainty, the unsettling realization that the foundations of his assumptions were cracking. "You're being naive, Gerald. Sentimentality clouding your judgment." He forced a laugh, a brittle, hollow sound that betrayed his inner turmoil. "Naive," Langston repeated, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Or perhaps, Arthur, I'm finally seeing clearly, seeing past the preconceived notions, the societal biases, that have blinded us for so long." He turned away, gazing out the window at the gathering dusk. "We build these walls, these ivory towers of academia, and we convince ourselves that brilliance only resides within them. We forget that true genius can bloom anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Kane felt a knot tighten in his chest, a strange mixture of resentment, confusion, and a nascent flicker of fear. He looked at Langston's back, the aging professor's silhouette outlined against the fading light, and saw not the familiar colleague, but a stranger. Someone who had glimpsed something he hadn't, something that had shifted his perspective, shaken the very foundations of his belief system. And in that moment, Kane knew with a chilling certainty that things at Milton University would never be the same again. The challenge now wasn't just about a mathematical equation. It was about confronting the deeply ingrained prejudices that shaped their world, the invisible barriers that kept brilliance hidden in plain sight. And for Kane, the most unsettling realization was that he, the esteemed professor, the gatekeeper of knowledge, had been blind to it all. The fluorescent lights of the Human Resources office hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony playing out in Clarice's chest. Friday afternoon, a time when most of the university staff were already envisioning the weekend's reprieve, found Clarice seated across from Miss Henderson, the HR director, and a stern-faced man she vaguely recognized as someone from the provost's office. The cheap plastic chair offered little comfort. It felt as cold and unyielding as the gazes directed at her. Clarice's hands, roughened from years of scrubbing floors and wringing out mops, clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel the calluses pressing against the worn fabric of her skirt, a small, tangible reminder of the life she had built, a life they seemed so eager to dissect and dismiss. Ms. Henderson's smile was strained, a thin veneer over the underlying tension. "Clarice, thank you for coming in on such short notice. We just wanted to have a little chat about recent events." The recent events, of course, referred to the equation. Professor Langston's challenge, scrawled across the chalkboard like a gauntlet thrown down, and her solution, scribbled underneath in the quiet solitude of the empty lecture hall. The whispers that had followed, growing louder with each passing day, now coalesced into the sterile room, this thinly veiled interrogation. "Of course," Clarice replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with unspoken accusations. She could practically taste the metallic tang of suspicion. "They think I cheated," she thought, the words a bitter pill in her throat. "They can't fathom that someone like me, a janitor, could possibly possess such knowledge." The man from the provost's office, whose name she now recalled was Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat. "We understand you've been working at the university for quite some time, Clarice." His voice was smooth, polished, like the mahogany desk separating them. 7 years, she confirmed, the words a dry rasp. 7 years of invisibility, of blending into the background, of being the unseen hand that maintained the pristine order of the hallowed halls of academia. 7 years, and now, suddenly, she was under a microscope. "And your duties primarily involve cleaning the mathematics building, is that correct?" Mr. Thompson continued, his eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. Clarice nodded, the gesture small and tight. "Are they trying to imply I stole the solution from a professor's office? From discarded notes?" The thought stung, a sharp jab of indignation. She had never violated anyone's privacy, had always treated the professors and their work with respect, even reverence. Miss Henderson chimed in, her tone softer, almost conciliatory. "Clarice, we're not accusing you of anything. We just want to understand the process. How you arrived at the solution." The word process hung in the air, thick with insinuation. Clarice's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "They want a confession," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. "They want me to admit I'm a fraud." "Tu saw the equation on the board," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "After everyone had left, Tu solved it." Each word felt like a betrayal, a forced unveiling of a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long. Mr. Thompson's eyebrows rose, a barely perceptible flicker of disbelief. "Just like that?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Clarice swallowed, her throat dry. Yes, she replied, the single syllable carrying the weight of years of suppressed passion, of countless nights spent poring over discarded textbooks and scribbling equations on scraps of paper. They don't see the hours I've spent studying, the theorems I've memorized, the problems I've solved in the quiet of my own room. She thought, a wave of despair washing over her. They only see the janitor, the uniform, the mop and bucket. The board was clean, wasn't it? Miss Henderson interjected, her gaze searching Clarice's face. The unspoken question hung in the air. Did you erase Professor Langston's work and replace it with your own? A flicker of defiance, a spark of anger, ignited within Clarice. It was a small flame, but it burned with an intensity that surprised even her. I cleaned the board, she stated, her voice gaining strength. She met Miss Henderson's gaze, her own eyes unwavering. I didn't break it. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with meaning. Clarice held her breath, waiting for the inevitable onslaught, the accusations, the dismissal. But it didn't come. Instead, she saw a flicker of something akin to respect in Miss Henderson's eyes, a grudging acknowledgement of her quiet dignity, her unwavering resolve. The meeting concluded shortly after, with no clear resolution, no apologies offered, and no accusations made outright. But as Clarice walked out of the sterile office and back into the bustling hallway, she felt a strange sense of calm. She had faced their doubts, their prejudices, their veiled accusations, and she had not broken. She had simply cleaned the board. And in doing so, she had unwittingly revealed a truth that they, in their ivory towers of academia, had failed to see. The truth that brilliance could bloom in the most unexpected places, even in the hands of a woman who held a mop and bucket. The rhythmic squeak of her sneakers against the pavement was a stark counterpoint to the disquiet brewing within her. Each footfall echoed the hollow ache in her chest, a persistent reminder of the week's events. The streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows that stretched and contorted with her every move, mirroring the distorted reflections of her own self-worth playing out in her mind. Had she been foolish, naive, to think that a simple equation, a fleeting moment of intellectual satisfaction, could bridge the chasm that separated her from the hallowed halls of academia? The biting night air did little to cool the flush of shame that crept up her neck. She hugged her worn coat tighter, the thin fabric offering scant comfort against the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She had dared to reach, to grasp at something beyond the grime and the drudgery, and for a brief, shimmering moment, she had felt the thrill of belonging. But the illusion had shattered, replaced by the cold reality of her station. A janitor, invisible, unworthy. The university, with its imposing brick buildings and air of intellectual superiority, felt more like a fortress than a place of learning. A fortress built to keep people like her out. The weekend had passed in a blur of restless nights and monotonous days. The silence of her small apartment had been a stark contrast to the hushed whispers and furtive glances she'd encountered at work. She'd scrubbed floors with a ferocity born of frustration, the squeak of the mop handle a grating soundtrack to her internal turmoil. Every reflection in the polished linoleum mocked her, a constant reminder of her invisibility. Even the familiar scent of disinfectant seemed to carry a tinge of bitterness, a testament to her marginalized existence. Monday morning arrived like a dreaded sentence. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach as she approached the imposing university gates. The weight of the past week pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of self-doubt and apprehension. She pushed open the heavy doors of the math department, the stale air thick with the scent of chalk dust and unspoken judgment. Her footsteps echoed in the deserted hallway, each click of her heels amplifying the sense of isolation. The janitorial closet, her sanctuary, her refuge, felt smaller than usual, the confines pressing in on her like the walls of a cell. She reached for her locker, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. A small, square piece of paper, almost the same color as the locker itself, was stuck to the door. Her breath hitched in her throat. A premonition, dark and heavy, settled in her gut. With trembling fingers, she peeled the note free. For words, scrawled in crude block letters, stared back at her. "Keep mopping. Don't get ahead of yourself." The air rushed from her lungs. The words, so simple, yet so loaded with contempt, pierced through her defenses like shards of ice. They were a stark reminder of her place, a brutal affirmation of the invisible barriers that confined her. A wave of nausea washed over her. The small closet, once a haven, now felt like a cage. The stale air choked her, the metallic tang of fear coating her tongue. She crumpled the note in her fist, the paper digging into her palm, a physical manifestation of the pain that tore through her. Her gaze drifted to the whiteboard at the end of the hallway, the one where Professor Langston had written his infamous equation. It was clean, spotless. Her solution, the elegant proof that had cost her so much, had been erased, wiped away as if it had never existed. As if she had never existed. The erasure felt like a deliberate act of violence, a symbolic annihilation of her intellect, her worth, her very being. A hollow laugh escaped her lips, a dry, rasping sound that startled even her. The janitor's closet, her refuge, her sanctuary, felt suffocating now. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the stench of disinfectant and the bitter taste of defeat. She leaned against the cool metal of the lockers, her legs trembling beneath her. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Anger, resentment, humiliation, and a deep, gnawing sense of injustice warred within her. She had dared to dream, to believe in herself. And for what? To be ridiculed, dismissed, erased. The tears she had held back for so long finally broke free, hot and stinging, blurring her vision. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the world, to retreat into the silent recesses of her mind. But the words on the note, the empty whiteboard, the whispers and glances, they all echoed in the darkness, a relentless chorus of disapproval. She felt a surge of defiance, a spark of anger that ignited within her, pushing back against the tide of despair. She wouldn't be broken. She wouldn't be silenced. She would find a way to rise above the prejudice, the ignorance, the suffocating limitations that sought to confine her. She would find a way to reclaim her voice, her intellect, her worth. The fire in her belly burned brighter, fueled by the injustice she had endured. It was a slow burn, a quiet simmering rage, but it was there, and it wouldn't be extinguished. Not this time. The air in the department meeting room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and simmering resentment. Clarice stood by the door, a silent observer in a room buzzing with whispers that felt like stinging insects. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, were cold and damp. Each hushed conversation, each sideways glance, seemed to reaffirm the same unspoken accusation. Fraud. She'd known, of course, that solving Professor Langston's equation wouldn't be met with universal acclaim. She'd anticipated the skepticism, the probing questions. What she hadn't anticipated was this suffocating atmosphere of disbelief, this collective judgment that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Her stomach churned. Perhaps she should have just stayed silent, remained invisible. Professor Langston, seated at the head of the long, polished table, cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the tense silence. "As we all know," he began, his voice a strained baritone, "the solution to the equation has been presented." His gaze flickered towards Clarice, a complex mix of bewilderment and something akin to grudging respect in his eyes. He hadn't expected her solution. He hadn't even considered her a contender. Now, the reality of her accomplishment sat before him, an uncomfortable truth he couldn't quite digest. Professor Kane, seated across from Langston, leaned forward, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Presented is one word for it, Gerald. Discovered, perhaps through some unorthodox means, is another." His voice dripped with insinuation. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. Cheating. The word echoed in Clarice's mind, a cold, hard stone against her ribs. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the faded floral pattern of the wallpaper. Brennan, the graduate assistant, shifted nervously in his seat. He'd spent hours poring over Clarice's solution, a mixture of fascination and suspicion churning within him. It was elegant, undeniably brilliant, but the sheer improbability of its origin gnawed at him. Perhaps, he offered, his voice barely above a whisper. It was just luck? He looked at Clarice, searching her face for some clue, some flicker of guilt or deception. He found nothing but a quiet, unwavering gaze. The whispers ignited again, a low hum of speculation. Clarice felt her breath catch in her throat. The room was closing in, the weight of their doubt crushing her. She had to leave, to escape this suffocating judgment. She took a half-step back, her hand reaching for the doorknob. No, she didn't. The voice, clear and strong, sliced through the whispers like a knife. Clarice froze, her hand hovering over the cool metal of the door handle. It was Dr. Brooks. She sat near the end of the table, her posture ramrod straight, her expression resolute. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Heads turned. Conversations ceased. All eyes were on Dr. Brooks, the only black professor in the department, a woman known for her sharp intellect and unwavering integrity. I went over her solution, Dr. Brooks continued, her voice unwavering. It was right. And not just right, she emphasized, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faculty. It was smart, deliberate. Her words hung in the air, a stark counterpoint to the insidious whispers. Clarice felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a small spark of hope in the face of the overwhelming doubt. Dr. Brooks' voice was a lifeline, a tether in the swirling vortex of accusation. She hadn't been abandoned, not entirely. Professor Kane scoffed. Marianne, with all due respect, you can't possibly. Dr. Brooks cut him off, her voice sharp. With all due respect, Arthur, she retorted, her eyes locking with his. I can and I do. I understand this equation. I understand the complexities involved. And I recognize brilliance when I see it. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Professor Kane opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He'd underestimated Dr. Brooks' resolve. He'd expected her to remain silent, to conform to the unspoken code of the department. He'd been wrong. Brennan, his curiosity piqued, leaned forward again. But how could a janitor? He trailed off, the unspoken bias hanging in the air. Dr. Brooks' gaze softened slightly as she looked at Brennan, then shifted to Clarice, who still stood by the door, half hidden in the shadows. Perhaps, she said, her voice laced with a touch of sadness, we should ask ourselves not how a janitor solved this equation, but why someone with such obvious talent has been relegated to emptying our wastebaskets. The question hung in the air, a stark indictment of the assumptions and prejudices that had kept Clarice hidden in plain sight. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. They were quieter, more hesitant, laced with a newfound uncertainty. The collective judgment had been cracked, a fissure of doubt appearing in the solid wall of disbelief. Clarice felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, followed by a strange sense of calm. The fear hadn't completely dissipated, but it was no longer a suffocating blanket. It was a manageable tremor, a low hum beneath the surface. She looked at Dr. Brooks, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude passing between them. Professor Langston, his face etched with a mixture of bewilderment and dawning comprehension, cleared his throat again. Perhaps, he said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority, we should adjourn this meeting. I believe, he added, glancing at Clarice, that there are some further discussions to be had. The meeting dissolved, the faculty filing out of the room, their expressions a mix of confusion, skepticism, and a grudging acknowledgement of the undeniable truth. Clarice Daniels, the janitor, had solved the unsolvable. And in doing so, she had exposed the cracks in the foundation of their carefully constructed academic world. The squeak of her cleaning cart wheels echoed in the deserted hallway, a sound so familiar it was almost a part of her. Clarice pushed the cart mechanically, her mind far removed from the gleaming linoleum floors. Dr. Brooks' words reverberated in the hollow spaces of her thoughts. Brilliance like that, it belongs in the light. Clarice's hand tightened on the cart handle, her knuckles blanching. It was a foreign concept, almost blinding. For so long, she had existed in the shadows, finding solace in the quiet anonymity of her work. The revelation of her solution to Langston's equation had ripped a hole in that carefully constructed veil, exposing her to a world she had retreated from years ago. She hadn't felt exposed like this since her father. The shame of that memory pricked at her, a familiar sting. A sudden, sharp tap on her shoulder made her jump. Turning, she saw Brennan, the graduate assistant, regarding her with a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. "Dr. Brooks wants to see you," he said, his voice hesitant, as if unsure of his ground. Clarice nodded mutely, a flicker of apprehension in her dark eyes. What now? Another interrogation? More probing questions about her methods? The idea made her stomach clench. It's a good thing," Brennan added, seemingly sensing her anxiety. He gave a small, awkward smile, a gesture so out of character for the usually stern young man that Clarice found it oddly reassuring. The walk to Dr. Brooks' office felt longer than usual, each step a weighted measure of her uncertainty. She tried to decipher the meaning behind Brennan's words. A good thing. Good how? What could possibly be good about this unwanted attention? Her mind, usually a haven of mathematical precision, was a tangled mess of apprehension and fragmented hopes. Dr. Brooks' office was small but filled with an air of quiet strength, much like the woman herself. Books lined the walls, their titles a testament to a lifetime dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. Dr. Brooks sat behind her desk, a warm smile softening the sharp intelligence in her eyes. "Clarice, please sit down." Clarice perched on the edge of the offered chair, feeling acutely aware of the worn fabric beneath her hands. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Clarice's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wished Dr. Brooks would just say whatever she had to say, end the agonizing suspense. "I've spoken to Professor Langston and several other members of the faculty," Dr. Brooks began, her voice calm and measured. "We're all in agreement that your contribution to the department shouldn't go unrecognized." Clarice's breath hitched. Recognition? Was this a veiled accusation? She braced herself. "We'd like to offer you the opportunity to audit any mathematics courses you choose. And we'd also like to invite you to collaborate with us on some of our ongoing research projects." Dr. Brooks' words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Clarice stared at her, dumbfounded. Audit classes? Collaborate? The concepts felt alien, like distant stars suddenly brought within reach. "Two don't understand," Clarice stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Dr. Brooks leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Because you've been brilliant in the dark for too long. And brilliance like that, it belongs in the light." The words struck Clarice with a force she hadn't anticipated. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, blurring the image of the kind woman before her. She blinked rapidly, trying to regain her composure. It was too much, too overwhelming. After years of hiding, of denying her own abilities, of accepting the shadows as her refuge, this sudden invitation into the light felt terrifying. Over the following weeks, Milton University was abuzz. The janitor who solved Langston's equation was no longer a whisper in the corridors, but a tangible presence. Clarice, however, found herself navigating this new reality with a cautious trepidation. Attending lectures felt surreal, sitting amongst the students she used to clean up after. The whispers, the stares, they were a constant reminder of her unusual position. Yet, the familiar pull of mathematics, the elegant dance of numbers and symbols, slowly began to chip away at the wall she had built around herself. The graduate students, initially hesitant, started approaching her with questions, drawn to the quiet authority with which she dissected complex theorems. Even Langston, his initial arrogance softened by a grudging respect, sought her input during faculty meetings. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but noticeable. The condescending tone was replaced with a tentative deference, as if he was still trying to reconcile the image of the janitor with the brilliant mathematician she had revealed herself to be. One afternoon, while mentoring a group of struggling students in the library, Clarice felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. The hesitant questions, the dawning comprehension in their eyes, it resonated with a deep part of her that had long been dormant. Explaining complex concepts, guiding them through the intricate pathways of mathematical logic, it felt right. This, she realized, was where she belonged. Not in the shadows, pushing a cleaning cart, but here, in the midst of the intellectual ferment, sharing the gift she had tried so hard to suppress. The weight of the past, the years of self-doubt and societal prejudice, began to lift. It wasn't easy. The echoes of Kane's dismissive words, the sting of Brennan's initial skepticism, they still lingered. But now, armed with Dr. Brooks' unwavering support and the growing recognition of her peers, Clarice began to reclaim her place. The light, once blinding, now felt like a warm embrace. She had stepped out of the shadows, and she was finally home. The late afternoon sun, a molten gold orb sinking behind the imposing clock tower, cast long, dancing shadows across the manicured lawns of Milton University. The air, still crisp with the remnants of spring's hesitant arrival, hummed with the low murmur of hundreds of voices. Clarice Daniels, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, stood backstage at the spring convocation, the rustling of her simple, navy blue dress a counterpoint to the rhythmic thump of her own heart. The scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, metallic tang of the microphone stand mingled in her nostrils, a strange cocktail of the ordinary and the extraordinary. She had spent countless hours in this very space, emptying overflowing bins, mopping up spilled coffee, an invisible presence amidst the bustling academic life. Today, however, she was anything but invisible. Her gaze drifted towards the sliver of the stage visible from behind the curtain. The sea of faces, a mosaic of caps and gowns, blurred in her vision. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. Just breathe, Clarice. Just breathe. The internal mantra, repeated over and over, did little to quell the rising tide of anxiety. This wasn't the familiar solitude of the empty lecture halls, the comforting anonymity of the night shift. This was exposure, raw and unforgiving. I never asked for this, she thought, the familiar bitterness creeping into her thoughts. She hadn't asked for the spotlight, hadn't sought the attention, the scrutiny. All she had wanted was to solve the equation, a quiet challenge to herself, a secret indulgence in the language that made sense to her, the language of numbers. Professor Langston's booming voice echoed from the stage, introducing her, each word a hammer blow against the fragile wall of her composure. He spoke of her remarkable achievement, her untapped potential, phrases that felt both alien and suffocating. Clarice swallowed hard, the dryness in her mouth intensifying. She remembered the disbelieving stares, the hushed whispers that had followed her in the weeks since the solution had been revealed. Professor Kane's thinly veiled accusations of cheating, Brennan's open skepticism, the weight of their doubt a tangible presence, a suffocating blanket. Then, she thought of Dr. Brooks, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief. The memory of Dr. Brooks's hand on her shoulder, the warmth of her smile, a beacon in the storm of uncertainty, steadied her. "You have a gift, Clarice," Dr. Brooks had said, her voice firm and reassuring. "Don't let anyone diminish it." A gift, Clarice thought, the word echoing in her mind. It felt strange, almost foreign, to think of her mathematical ability as a gift. For so long, it had been a secret, a hidden part of herself, carefully guarded, tucked away from the world's judging eyes. The applause swelled, signaling Langston's conclusion. Clarice took a deep, shaky breath and stepped onto the stage. The sudden glare of the spotlights momentarily blinded her, the sea of faces swimming in a hazy blur. She gripped the podium, the cool metal a grounding presence amidst the swirling chaos of her emotions. As her vision cleared, she saw them, the faces of the faculty, the students, a tapestry of curiosity, skepticism, and, surprisingly, admiration. She saw Professor Kane, his lips pursed in a thin line, his eyes narrowed in scrutiny. Brennan, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and reluctant respect. And Dr. Brooks, her smile warm and encouraging, a silent promise of support. Clarice began to speak, her voice at first a hesitant whisper, then gaining strength, resonating with a quiet power that surprised even herself. "I never wanted to be special," she said, the words echoing in the hushed hall. "I just didn't want to be forgotten." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The silence, thick with unspoken emotions, stretched, broken only by the chirping of birds outside the open windows. She continued, her voice gaining confidence with each word. She spoke of her love for mathematics, the solace she found in its intricate patterns, the quiet joy of solving a complex problem. She spoke of the years she had spent cleaning these very halls, the countless hours she had spent observing the academic world from the periphery, a silent observer, a ghost in the machine. She spoke of the assumptions, the prejudices she had faced, the subtle yet pervasive ways in which her potential had been dismissed, ignored. Her words, simple yet profound, resonated with an unexpected force, weaving a spell over the audience. They listened, captivated, as she laid bare her vulnerabilities, her fears, her hopes. "Talent doesn't discriminate," she said, her voice rising in intensity. "It doesn't care about your background, your job title, or the color of your skin. It simply exists, waiting to be nurtured, waiting to be discovered." She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze lingering on Dr. Brooks, a silent acknowledgement of the woman who had helped her find her voice. The words flowed from her, a torrent of suppressed emotions, a lifetime of unspoken truths. She spoke of the importance of perseverance, the power of believing in oneself, even in the face of adversity. She spoke of the hidden potential that resided within each individual, waiting to be unleashed, waiting to bloom. As she concluded her speech, a wave of applause erupted, washing over her, a tangible expression of their appreciation, their understanding. The sound, warm and enveloping, chased away the lingering vestiges of her anxiety, replacing them with a sense of quiet triumph. She had done it. She had faced her fears, confronted the biases, and claimed her rightful place. The janitor, the invisible woman, had finally been seen. And in that moment, as the applause faded and the world shifted back into focus, Clarice Daniels knew that her journey had just begun. The path ahead, she realized, might not be easy, but it was hers to walk, her own equation to solve. The faint scent of chalk dust, a smell Clarice had once associated with invisibility, now held a different resonance, a sense of belonging. Lecture Hall D, once a space she navigated in the quiet hours before dawn, now hummed with the energy of students eager to decipher the mysteries of mathematics. She stood at the chalkboard, a half-formed equation swirling in her mind, its elegance both intimidating and exhilarating. The whispers, once tinged with doubt and speculation, had transformed. They were the murmurs of concentration, of shared intellectual curiosity, a symphony of minds grappling with the same complex problem she was about to unravel. A slight tremor, a ghost of the old insecurity, danced in her stomach. "They're watching," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. "They're waiting for you to fail." But another voice, stronger now, more assured, countered, "Let them watch." With a steady hand, Clarice completed the equation, each stroke of the chalk a small victory against the invisible walls that had once confined her. The silence that followed was not the heavy, judgmental quiet of before. It was the contemplative pause of comprehension, the brief stillness before the eruption of understanding. Then the whispers began anew, this time laced with admiration, with a nascent respect that warmed a place deep inside her. "Brilliant!" a student breathed from the front row, his eyes wide with awe. Clarice met his gaze, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. The old Clarice, the one who would have shrunk under such scrutiny, was a shadow receding into the past. This new Clarice, the one who had claimed her place, felt a surge of something akin to pride, a quiet satisfaction that resonated deeper than any accolade she could have imagined. Later that day, amidst the bustling hallways of the mathematics department, A young student, his brow furrowed in concentration, approached her hesitantly. He held a crumpled sheet of paper in his hand, his expression a mixture of frustration and hope. "Professor Daniels," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm having trouble with this proof. I've been working on it for hours, but I can't seem to get it right." Clarice looked at the young man, seeing in his struggle a reflection of her own past, the countless hours spent grappling with complex concepts in the solitude of her small apartment. A pang of empathy, sharp and familiar, pierced through her. "Show me," she said gently, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came not from a title, but from genuine understanding. As he explained his reasoning, his voice growing more confident, Clarice listened intently, her mind already dissecting the problem, searching for the missing link. He stumbled over a particular step, his voice trailing off in uncertainty. "I just don't understand how it connects to this," he confessed, pointing to a line of the proof. "Look," Clarice said, her finger tracing the equation. "You're thinking too linearly. Try approaching it from this angle." She then proceeded to break down the complex concept, explaining it in clear, simple terms, weaving in analogies that resonated with the student's experience. He stared at the equation, his eyes widening with understanding. "Oh," he breathed, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "I see it now." He looked at Clarice, his expression alight with gratitude. How did you know?" Clarice paused, considering his question. The truth, the years of solitary study, the nights spent poring over textbooks by the dim glow of a lamp, felt too raw, too vulnerable to share. "Because I've been doing this since I was younger than you," she said, a hint of wistful amusement in her voice. The student, oblivious to the weight of her words, beamed at her. "Thank you, Professor Daniels. You're a lifesaver." He hurried off, eager to apply his newfound understanding. Clarice watched him go, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her. The satisfaction of helping him, the echo of her own past struggles, the quiet affirmation of her hard-won place in this world. The setting sun cast long shadows across the campus grounds, painting the brick buildings in hues of orange and gold. Clarice walked slowly, the crisp autumn air swirling around her. The weight of the past, the years of invisibility, the sting of prejudice, began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of lightness, of freedom. She had not only solved equations. She had solved a more complex problem, the equation of her own self-worth. The whispers no longer mattered. The doubts, the judgments, the prejudices, they were echoes fading into the distance. What remained was the quiet certainty of her own ability, the unwavering conviction that her voice, once silenced, now resonated with the clear, undeniable language of mathematics. And that, she realized, was a truth no equation could ever fully capture.